Hello and welcome back to Beaver Hunter Scale Models. In today's video I want to show you how I built and painted this small diorama and used resin water for the first time. So let's get started. Okay, I started off camera with building the basic shape out of Styrofoam. If you are interested in how I cut and shape Styrofoam, I will link you a video here where I use my hot wire cutter. And here I'm sealing the surface with Modellbau spachtel by Bergswerk and smooth it out with a wet brush. For nice and smooth edges I used balsa wood and applied it to the basic shape of the diorama. I glued it in place with wood glue and fixed it with pins so it stays in position and doesn't bend. And after it was dry I could apply the shape more exactly to the diorama. Then I used Vallejo's earth texture paste to give the ground a more earth-like look and apply the diorama to the balsa wood frame. And in addition I wanted the foam to be protected because I wasn't sure how the resin water would go through the pastes and attack the foam maybe. By then the wood glue was dry enough so I could remove the pins and fill the holes with the Modellbau spatula. And the edges had to be filled too because my balsa wood was just as white as the diorama base. I wanted to recreate a Normandy scene here for future figure projects, and I needed some vegetation consisting of trees and hedgerows. So I grabbed me some sticks from a walk in the forest and applied some sea foam to it to make it look like a tree. I'm no gardener, but I guess this will do. In support of the super glue, I used earth texture again for a stronger hold of the sea foam. Then I decided where to plant the trees and made some holes with my hobby knife. As a final layer I mixed some real earth, sand, wood glue and water and mixed me a nice and creamy earth paste, which was then applied as a final layer of the ground. And because of these two vertical areas I had to make sure that the paste is not too thin. Then I started to create the creek bed where I wanted to pour the resin later. I therefore pressed some bigger stones into the still wet earth paste. And I sprinkled some more earth on top of the still wet paste. After pushing around the dry earth with a soft brush I soaked everything up with lacquer thinner. This breaks the surface tension and I then could flood everything with diluted wood glue to fix it in place forever. I used dried roots from my garden to recreate some exposed roots at the creek's bed. These were so light that just a drop of wood glue was needed to fix them in place. And some roots onto the earth wall where the hedgerow will be placed on. The basic shape of the hedgerow was built out of sea foam, which was glued into the base. And of course, all vegetation will receive some foliage later. After the contact points of the roots dried, I fixed them in place with super glue in the positions I wanted them to be. Then it was time for some static grass. I applied undiluted wood glue by brush and sprinkled some static grass on top of it. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong, but my static grass is always pretty flat. I tried out a lot of different ways of applying the static grass or holding the applicator, but I somehow always end up with rather flat grass. So after a second round of not standing static grass, I switched to sanitary hemp for some longer grass tufts. To erase the straight cuts, I used my electric razor to give it a more natural, uneven shape. And with my airbrush I could easily blow away the excess. For some more variation, I used this vegetation mat and cut it into small pieces. This mat is self-gluing, but I wanted to support the bond with some wood glue. And after applying these with my tweezers, it was time for some first paint. I started with priming all vegetation with black primer. This is because I want to unify all vegetation with some nice vivid green tones instead of the unnatural static grass look. And the bigger stones in the creek bed were primed too because I wanted to paint them individually later. The hedgerows and the trees of course were primed too, and then I applied a coat of leather brown as a base paint for the wood tones. And as I had the leather brown in my airbrush, I used it to neutralize the overspray of the black primer on the ground. Before I could start spraying the green tones, I had to apply the foliage to the hedgerow first. This was done with hairspray, sprinkled some foliage on top of it and fixed it with some more hairspray. Before I could start to green the trees, I needed to finish the bark first. This was done with some dry brushing over the leather brown base paint. As a first layer, I applied some fine turf with hairspray and then worked this realistic floor product piece by piece into the tree. This was a pretty messy job with all the hairspray, and I'm not saying that this is a perfect replication of a tree. But like I said, I'm not a gardener, and in the end I'm pretty happy with how my trees look. Because I ran out of hairspray, I had to use some rattle can matte varnish to apply some loose foliage from upside down. Like this I could give it a more natural shape and fill the last gaps. Now I could finally start adding the green tones with my airbrush, and I started with a bright green as a base paint. Of course, the plastic-like looking foliage on the hedgerow was painted too. And the trees got some variation by spraying the greens randomly into the leaves. I lightened up the green base paint with a yellowish tone And like this, sprayed some variation and dried tufts. And with some more yellow into the mix, I sprayed last highlights. And again, the trees received some bursts too. To get rid of some green overspray and lighten up the ground a bit, I used Tamiya's Deck 10. As it turned out later, this step was not really necessary, but at this point I feared the ground would be too dark without this step. It's just sometimes that scale modeling is a bit of trial and error, and you are always wiser afterwards. As the next step, I applied Ammo's wet mud to create a wet and moisten creek bed. This was applied diluted with thinner, and here I learned that the step before was totally unnecessary here. On the middle and the top area I diluted it even more to get just a base coat for the ground. For some variation I applied damp earth, also diluted with thinner. And for even more variation and some dry tones I applied Kursk earth, which was applied in the middle and the upper area. Then I started to paint the stones in the creek bed and some smaller stones in the middle area individually. Here I used several grays and earth tones for variation. And with heavily diluted Deck 10 and white I emphasized the raised spot of the stones a bit. And I repainted the roots with some diluted brown tones to neutralize some overspray from the airbrush. To make the creek bed look more wet, I applied undiluted dark brown wash. And here I used diluted dark brown wash to make a pin wash around the small painted stones. And to simulate some algae and verdigris, I used AK's moss deposit. At this point I wasn't sure how much of all these details will be visible after pouring the resin, but I just had to do it and see what happens. As a small nice detail I wanted to create an ivy-like plant at the earth wall, and I herefore used AK's foliage. These are supposed to be leaves in 1/72 scale, but I thought it would be a great ivy in 1/35 scale. As last details and for more optical interest I applied some more bigger and smaller roots into the creek's bed. Okay, now it's getting serious. I marked the position where I wanted the resin to be and then used frog tape to create the mold. And I used some stronger tape to keep the frog tape in position and avoid it to make some funny shapes. Then I used a small layer of still water to seal the ground and the tape. And with a soft brush I made sure every air bubbles were gone. For a straighter shape of the mold I glued some popsicle sticks to the tape and hoped to keep the tape more straight here. And I think it worked out nice and wasn't a bad idea. Okay, time to pour some resin. As resin can produce toxic fumes, I always make sure to protect myself with wearing a mask. I calculated the amount of resin I would need for this project and mixed it in the ratio specified on the box. As I hadn't a successful try with resin before, I was kind of nervous here, and I'm glad everything worked out good. After letting the mix rest for a few minutes, I poured it slowly into the mold. I decided to keep it simple here and keep it clear without adding any paint. And as a small creek, I think it's okay if it's not really brown water. And I must say, I'm pretty amazed by the clear liquid resin here. Then I tried to get rid of any air bubbles with a piece of wire here, or using my gas blowtorch. Obviously you have to be very careful here to not set the tape or the diorama on fire. And removing the tape was a very exciting moment for me. Seems like the surface was a bit rough because of the tape, and so I grabbed me some alcohol and cleaned the surface first. Then I grabbed my hobby knife and cut flush the edge of the resin because it climbed up the tape. With my old Revell glossy varnish, I was able to clear the sides, and you could now finally look into the resin. 3 coats of the glossy varnish were necessary, and the cutting edges were treated too. To recreate a calm current, I used Vallejo's water texture to make small waves onto the creek. As this is no ocean or a big lake, I wanted to keep them rather small and not overdo it here. To finish the sides, I used diluted Vallejo black paint, and with my brush I applied it in a thick layer. This always changes the whole look of the project to me. To make the creek bank look more damp and wet from the water, I applied some wet effects and blended them into the surroundings with thinner. I felt that the green could use some more variation, and I applied some Tamiya yellow-green paint with a brush to lighten up the tips of the grass turfs a bit. And for some variation and some dried leaves in the hedgerows, I applied it here and some khaki paint with the brush too. Now it was finally time to glue the trees in place, which was not very easy because of the hedgerow. And for a non-gardener, I think it came out pretty nice. And as a last step, I wanted to give the paper leaves a bit more variation by applying green oil paint in several shades. And the plants from the vegetation mat were also painted like this to give them more variation. And with that being said, we finally made it. Thank you very much for watching my video. I hope it was more interesting than boring for you. I'm really looking forward to your feedback and constructive criticism, and if you like what you saw, please consider subscribing. Thank you and stay safe.